It's January in the UK, a cold reminder that inflation may have hit its highest level in 10 months. The latest forecasts suggest consumer prices are up 2.8% on a year-over-year basis, spearheaded by rogue factors like private school fees. Yes, even education isn't immune from the price hike epidemic, along with the erratic reversal of previously dormant elements that had momentarily cooled down inflation in December. Now, if that doesn't set off alarm bells in the minds of the Bank of England, policymakers, nothing will. What really puts a damper on the economic mood is that the BoE is seeing red. Energy bills, stubborn wage growth, and volatile services prices are converging to push the inflation peak to about 3.7% later in the year. Meanwhile, sneaky underlying price pressures, especially in the services sector, with forecasts showing a climb from 4.4% to 5.2%, are enough to make even the most seasoned veteran of economic policy recoil. Let's face it, when you have private school fees and airfares suddenly making a comeback as inflation drivers, you know something is deeply rotten in the state of economic governance. Let's not pull any punches here. The government's decision to put private school fees under the VAT regime, timid at best and damaging at worst, illustrates a profound disconnect between policy rhetoric and economic reality. Instead of insulating the public from economic shocks, policies are inadvertently fueling the price fire. It's as if the government decided to toss gasoline on a smoldering embers pile and then wonder why the blaze got out of control. Backing hints of a generous half-point rate cut by two officials in a recent monetary policy meeting only adds to the ironies. While some policymakers are scheming for a fiscal band-aid, the majority remain on high alert, cautious and rightly so. They view any premature easing as akin to opening the floodgates on borrowing costs, further destabilizing an already shaky economy. The truth is, the freewheeling politics of short-term relief are no substitute for long-term, structural reforms. Ballooning inflation and stagnant economic growth are not easing issues, they're a prelude to a full-blown recession. Let's turn our laser focus on the UK's labour market, which is hardly the calm haven one would hope for. The recent data shows wage growth, excluding bonuses, picking up to around 5.9% in the fourth quarter, versus the previous 5.6%. Yes, it might signal abundance, but in a cost-of-living crisis, rising wages are a double-edged sword. On one side, employees are feeling the squeeze of escalating consumer prices, on the other, employers, scarred by the severe post-COVID recruitment hassle, are hoarding labor instead of trimming headcounts. This paradoxical hoarding is creating a scenario where wage inflation persists even when the demand for new hires is drying up. In this setting, it's not surprising that underlying price pressures remain stubbornly high, further disappointing the BoE's hopes of a soft landing toward its 2% target. The UK's woes are not unique, a rotten apple in the economic barrel of global mismanagement is spreading its decay. Let's start down under. In Australia, the Reserve Bank is about to join the global monetary easing parade with its first rate cut in the cycle, easing the cash rate target to 4.1%. New Zealand isn't far behind, with expectations of a 50 basis point reduction. These actions are not merely technical adjustments but desperate moves by central banks to stimulate economies in an environment where inflation remains sticky despite all the prodding. If you need convincing evidence of the mess, consider Japan. Despite a seemingly benign bout of consumer inflation hitting the central bank's target for the 34th month in a row, underlying themes of sagging private demand and relentless rate hikes loom large. Japan's minimal growth in 2024 is a symptom of a larger malaise, a consequence of policy inertia and the inability to spur robust domestic consumption. And across the Pacific? The United States is wading through its economic data sea. Housing starts slowed in January as high borrowing costs and inflated resale prices turn the housing market into a frozen tundra rather than a booming engine of growth. Add in the latest sentiment from the University of Michigan's Consumer Survey, showing a slump in optimism and a spike in inflation expectations, and you have a recipe for further economic arms trade between markets globally. The mixed messages coming out of the Federal Reserve's recent meetings, where officials like Vice Chair Philip Jefferson and others reiterate the need for caution, offer little relief. In a climate where the Fed is content to keep rates unchanged while inflation lurks ominously in the background, the message is clear: policymakers are caught between a rock and a hard place, and ordinary consumers suffer the consequences. Let's cast our gaze north to Canada, where inflation data for January is expected to tick upward to 1.9%. While that might sound benign, the underlying pressure is building. The prospect of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats adds an extra layer of complexity. Central Bank Governor Tiff Macklem's upcoming speech on trade, structural change and monetary policy is being scrutinized for clues on how Canada might combat an intensifying trade war. The irony is hard to miss: Canada, a stalwart of global economic stability, now finds itself on the precipice of a tariff-induced economic freefall, largely owing to political brinkmanship from across the border. Across the Atlantic in Latin America, the narrative is equally dramatic. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico each display a fragmented picture of economic mismanagement intermingled with gusts of optimism that barely mask the underlying vulnerabilities. In Brazil, inflation expectations keep rising unchecked. With the 12-month estimate meandering around 5.87% after 18 consecutive weeks of climbs, one cannot help but question the central bank's aggressive tightening cycle. December's GDP proxy figures broadcast a subtle yet ominous whisper of weakening growth, a harbinger perhaps of a larger downturn if the central bank's measures do not translate into immediate results. And while Argentina touts its first fiscal surplus in over a decade, it's hard not to view that achievement with a smirk. After all, a surplus amid a $18.9 billion trade surplus pales next to the structural reforms desperately needed to stave off an economic collapse. Mexico, ever the economic enigma, continues its struggle. With retail sales figures and GDP proxy data shedding light on continued contraction, the nation stands as a grim testament to the perils of structural inefficiencies and political short-sightedness. Africa, too, is entangled in the web of economic volatility. Nigeria's central bank is predicted to maintain a key rate of 27.5% as inflation reaches its predicted peak. It's not just Nigeria, Botswana, Egypt, and the list goes on, are locked in a dance of monetary indecision. Botswana's reliance on diamond exports, Egypt's prolonged inflationary pressures, and South Africa's delicate balancing act between fiscal consolidation and necessary reform all point to a growing realization: the economic challenges we face are far more systemic than just one country's policy missteps. For instance, South Africa's inflation lifted from 3.0% to 3.2% in January, fed by surging food and gasoline prices. And as Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana prepares to unveil the annual budget, investors remain increasingly skeptical whether the government can stick to its fiscal consolidation plans amidst rising spending pressures. Calls for expedited energy and logistics reforms have never been louder, especially as international protectionist policies, epitomized by Trump's tariff threats, loom ominously. In Europe, the drama unfolds on multiple fronts. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz reassured the public, albeit with a measure of hollow bravado, that the European Union can defy any U.S. tariff threats. Yet the data paints a different picture. The EU's substantial and record-high surplus in goods traded with the U.S. has inadvertently attracted the ire of protectionist forces. The looming threat of new tariffs to curb perceived trade imbalances has added strain to an already frayed economic tapestry. Further complicating matters are the mixed signals from the European Central Bank, ECB. With chief economist Philip Lane slated to appear in Vienna and the ECB's 2024 financial statements revealing a loss, the credibility of Europe's monetary policy is under intense scrutiny. The loss, once an anomaly, is now a recurring theme that exposes the fragile underbelly of a monetary union grappling with divergent fiscal policies and structural imbalances. The recurring theme in all these headlines is one of inertia, confusion, and ultimately, economic policies that are a reaction rather than a solution. The UK's soaring inflation, spurred by measures like imposing VAT on private school fees, is just one headline in a sprawling narrative of global economic mismanagement. The interconnectedness of modern economies means that what happens in one part of the globe shakes the foundations worldwide, creating a domino effect that could precipitate an outright recession. Recent data from the U.S. housing market, for example, shows that builders are scaling back on new home construction, not because of a lack of demand, but due to elevated borrowing costs in a high-priced resale market. Declining contract closings on previously owned home sales further hint at a cooling market amid high interest rates, a quagmire where both new construction and the resale sector are caught in a vice grip of economic uncertainty. If the Fed's tentative stance on maintaining rates persists while inflation expectations remain entrenched, the whole scenario could rapidly tip from a cautionary tale into a full-blown recession. It's one thing to throw around percentages and interest rate cuts, it's quite another to see these numbers manifest in the lives of ordinary citizens and businesses. Let's look at some of the latest examples from our global economic stage. UK's price surge. Recent consumer surveys indicate that families are feeling the pinch more than ever. With private school fees now subject to VAT, some parents are reporting an extra bill of up to 20% on fees, a cost that many simply cannot absorb given stagnant wages and rising living expenses. This policy reversal, instead of safeguarding educational accessibility, is now creating public outrage and adding fuel to the inflationary fire. Australian policy shift. In Australia, the Reserve Bank's decision to cut the cash rate target to 4.1% marks a significant pivot toward easing. This move comes off the back of robust data that saw core inflation slow more rapidly than expected in Q4 of last year. According to recent reports by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, consumer price growth, while still elevated, is now showing early signs of deceleration, a hopeful sign that bears watching closely. Japan's inflation conundrum. Japan's economy, often held as a beacon of stability, now finds itself in a precarious situation. Despite the central bank's target being met for 34 consecutive months, underlying private demand is shabbily weak. Reports from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry reveal that consumer spending has dropped by nearly 1.2% in the last quarter, a sign that, despite surface-level optimism, the heart of Japan's economic engine is sputtering. U.S. housing market realities. Recent data from the National Association of Realtors has shown that contract closings in the previously owned housing sector are down almost 5% compared to the same period last year. This drop is significant given that the market was expected to remain buoyant in the face of declining interest rates. Instead, the combination of high mortgage rates and inflated resale prices has created a perfect storm, a sentiment now echoed by economists who warn that the Fed's inaction might, in fact, be punishing the housing market. EU trade imbalances. The record surplus in goods traded by Germany with the US earlier this month isn't just a number, it's a glaring indicator of a transatlantic imbalance that could trigger severe retaliatory measures. The EU's trade data, now scrutinized by protectionist factions in Washington, has prompted many European policymakers to redouble their efforts to negotiate a balanced trade agreement. Yet, the lack of decisive action only serves to exacerbate the risk of a trade war, which would undoubtedly worsen inflationary pressures across the continent. Latin America's economic tug-of-war. In Brazil, the persistent rise in inflation expectations, as seen in the Federal Reserve of Brazil's latest survey, underscores the challenges faced by emerging markets. Despite a series of interest rate hikes aimed at curbing inflation, the economy shows weak signs of recovery, with consumer confidence remaining low and industrial production stagnating. Meanwhile, Mexico's latest GDP proxy data reinforces a narrative of contraction, with retail sales falling short of expectations by over 2%, a figure that economic analysts now predict could worsen if structural reforms are not enacted promptly. African monetary struggles. In Nigeria, where inflation is expected to have peaked at around 27.5%, the central bank's decision to leave the key rate unchanged is nothing short of a double-edged sword. While it may provide short-term relief, the long-term implications, if inflationary pressures are not addressed through substantial fiscal and structural reforms, could be dire. This sentiment is echoed in Botswana and Egypt, where similar concerns about the efficacy of monetary policy have left investors increasingly cautious. So, what's the takeaway from this global quasi-epic of economic misadventures? Simply put, policymakers across the world are stymied by a bureaucracy that prefers playing with numbers and rhetoric rather than daring to implement real, transformative reforms. The UK's current predicament is a textbook case of how politically motivated decisions, like the ludicrous VAT imposition on private school fees, can have unintended inflationary consequences. While some policymakers flirt with the idea of quick fixes, the underlying problems remain untouched: excessive regulation, a reluctance to let markets adjust naturally, and a persistent reliance on monetary policy as a panacea for structural issues. In every corner of the globe, from the high streets of London to the suburbs of Tokyo, from the bustling markets of New York to the quiet corridors of Canberra, the same story is unfolding. Inflation is no longer a transient inconvenience, it has become a symptom of deeper malaise, one that is rooted in mismanagement, short-termism, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how economic forces operate. Let's not pretend that these issues are solely the fault of external factors, like global supply chain disruptions or temporary labor shortages due to the post-COVID rebound. While those elements contribute to the chaos, the primary culprit is a chronically complacent government policy framework that refuses to engage with the reality on the ground. The Federal Reserve's tepid signals in the US, the ECB's reactionary measures in Europe, and even Australia's hesitant tactical adjustments all hint at a broader, systemic failure of economic stewardship. For those of us following these developments with an economist's keen eye, the numbers and trends are a clarion call for structural change. Let's highlight several key recommendations that emerge from this data-driven critique. 1. Revisit taxation on critical services. Instead of burdening essential services like education with VAT, thereby exacerbating inflation and eroding consumer confidence, governments should explore alternative revenue streams that do not penalize already strained households. Targeted tax reforms that protect vulnerable segments of the population should be high on the political agenda. 2. Flexibility in monetary policy. The central banks, while right to be cautious, must adopt a more flexible and responsive stance. The idea of cutting rates as an automatic remedy for a weakening economy is outdated. Instead, policymakers should emphasize a blend of interest rate adjustments with structural reforms aimed at boosting productivity and consumer confidence. The data from Australia and New Zealand, where aggressive rate cuts have begun to show early signs of economic rebalancing, provides a compelling case study. 3. Labor market reforms. With wage pressures mounting and labor hoarding becoming the new norm, the UK, and other advanced economies, needs to re-examine labor policies. Encouraging greater mobility, investing in skill development, and streamlining regulations that discourage layoffs or flexible work arrangements could help mitigate wage inflation without sacrificing the competitiveness of the labor market. 4. Strengthen consumer confidence through transparent policy. Across the board, the misalignment between policy proclamations and on-the-ground data is rife. Whether it's in the US housing market or the sluggish European trade figures, a transparent acknowledgement of the challenges, and a firm plan to address them, could help restore consumer and business confidence. Communicating a clear, data-backed strategy is essential to rebuilding trust in government economic management. 5. Enhance global cooperation and coordination. The era of isolated economic policy is long gone. With interconnected markets, unilateral actions, such as Trump's tariff threats, only serve to worsen the economic fallout. Instead, a coordinated, multilateral approach to trade and economic reform is essential to prevent localized issues from spiraling into global recessions. The diplomatic posture of the EU and cooperative moves by central banks across multiple continents are promising signs, but more needs to be done to counter protectionist impulses. For years, the public and professionals in the finance sector alike have been warning about what happens when economic policy becomes divorced from economic reality. The current scenario, where inflation, stagnant or even declining domestic growth, and rising consumer prices converge, is a manifestation of that disconnect. It is a stark reminder that economic stability is not achieved through fiddling at the margins with interest rates or through ad hoc policy measures, but through bold, structural reforms that are both proactive and adaptive to changing conditions. This crucial moment calls for a genuine wake-up call to government officials who claim to safeguard the economic interests of the citizenry. The evidence from the UK, as well as global markets, shows that incremental adjustments are simply band-aids on wounds that require surgery. An economic system mired in short-term fixes is doomed to repeat its mistakes, over and over again. Let's talk about some real-world impacts to drive home the point. In London, small business owners are reporting that rising operational costs, driven by ever-increasing energy bills and the cascading effect of higher service prices, are forcing them to scale back investments and delay hiring. In Manchester, university students, already burdened by tuition fees, now face the additional sting of higher private school fees impacting their families. And in rural areas of the UK, where wages have seen modest growth but inflation has outpaced these gains, everyday expenses have become a trial by fire. These are not isolated anecdotes, they're the tangible outcomes of policy decisions that seem more concerned with political optics than with fostering a healthy, sustainable economy. The common refrain from politicians, that they are doing everything possible to maintain stability, is contradicted by the daily struggles of millions who find themselves caught in the crossfire of misguided economic maneuvers. To those who argue that these economic challenges are merely cyclical or that the current measures will eventually bear fruit, consider the data. For instance, while the bows sing songs of caution regarding a potential recession, the underlying metrics reveal a more dismal picture: rising wages paired with persistent inflation, an overheated services sector, and a labor market that is more stagnant than revitalized. The quantitative easing from central banks, initially celebrated as an economic savior, has now morphed into a seductive yet destructive path leading to asset bubbles and distorted economic signals. Similarly, in economies like Brazil and Argentina, which boast contrasting fiscal profiles, a surplus in Argentina versus persistent inflation in Brazil, the lesson is clear: without comprehensive structural reforms, the cycle of tightening and easing will continue to undermine genuine economic resilience. The relevant data trends aren't just numbers on a chart, they are indictments of policies that favor short-term fixes over a long-term vision. At the heart of this extensive analysis lies a simple truth: economic rejuvenation demands political bravery. In an era where populist pressures and short-sighted electoral cycles incentivize immediate, visible results, implementing drastic measures to overhaul flawed systems is a political risk that few are willing to take. Yet, as we have seen time and again, the alternative, a continued reliance on incremental, barely effective measures, only postpones the inevitable reckoning. The BOE's cautious stance on further rate cuts in the face of stubborn inflation, the Fed's reluctant signals amid mixed data, and the European policymakers dithering in the wake of external tariff threats all point to a clear disconnect between what is politically expedient and what is economically necessary. It is time for governments and central banks to stop tiptoeing around issues and instead face them head-on with the kind of decisive reforms that may be unpopular in the short term but are indispensable for long-term stability. If we are to escape the cycle of recurring inflation and sluggish growth, the following strategic priorities must be set in motion. 1. Tax and fee reforms. Governments must dismantle the layers of inefficient taxation that harm critical sectors. Removing or revising regressive measures, such as the imposition of VAT on private education, a policy that has contributed directly to rising inflation, would offer immediate relief to those most affected while also promoting sustainable economic behavior. 2. Monetary policy calibration. Central banks need to strike a delicate balance between stimulating growth and preventing runaway inflation. This involves a more nuanced approach that goes beyond shoehorned rate cuts. Instead, comprehensive frameworks that incorporate fiscal policy cooperation, targeted liquidity injections, and reforms aimed at increasing productivity must be developed. 3. Structural reforms in labor and markets. The taut wage price spiral in the UK and other developed economies needs immediate addressal. Reforming labor markets by promoting flexibility, reducing regulatory burdens, and encouraging workforce adaptability could break the feedback loop that pins up wages while prices soar unchecked. 4. Enhanced international coordination. In our interwoven global economy, unilateral protectionist measures, be they tariffs, trade barriers, or ad hoc fiscal adjustments, do more harm than good. There is an urgent need for transnational economic dialogue aimed at crafting mutually beneficial policies. The EU's ongoing struggle with U.S. tariff threats, for example, should be a catalyst for fostering deeper economic and political alliances, rather than a pretext for inward-looking economic nationalism. 5. An emphasis on confidence and transparency. Ultimately, rebuilding economic credibility hinges on clear, transparent, and honest communication between policymakers and the public. The recent spate of opaque decisions and contradictory signals from major central banks has not only eroded public trust but also created unnecessary uncertainty in the markets. Reinstating confidence requires a reset, a willingness to communicate the trade-offs involved in tough decisions and a commitment to measurable targets and accountability. In wrapping up this extensive analysis, it becomes starkly apparent that the economic issues we face today are symptoms of a much larger malaise. Whether it's the UK's staggering inflation fueled by misguided government policies, the apparent complacency in the face of rising consumer prices, or the systemic failures observed globally, from Australia's timid rate cuts to the EU's cautious stance against US tariffs, the underlying message is unequivocal: our economic governance is in dire need of a radical makeover. For ordinary citizens feeling the pinch of rising prices and diminished purchasing power, and for the professionals who navigate this turbulent financial landscape on a daily basis, the time for complacency is over. This is not the era for half measures or for dancing around tough decisions. Instead, it is a call to arms for policymakers, central bankers, and the public alike, a rallying cry that demands true political courage and visionary reforms. The data is irrefutable. The slopes of inflation are steepening, wage pressures are mounting, and the global interdependencies mean that no nation is an island in this economic storm. If government interventions continue to rely on outdated monetary policy tricks and politically expedient measures, the risk is not just another recession, it is a systemic collapse that will take years to rectify. And history has shown us that the price of inaction is far too high. Let us then, as keen observers and passionate advocates for sound economic policy, insist on a new paradigm, one where long-term stability trumps short-term palliatives, where transparency replaces obfuscation, and where the real interests of the public are placed above fleeting political gains. The time for bold action is now. If the government and the central banks cannot rise to the challenge, the consequences will be borne by every citizen, every small business owner, and every future generation that must inherit the wreckage of today's mismanagement. So, as we close this deep dive into the global economic chaos, with the boisterous, satirical spirit of boss economics, we cheer not for the status quo, but for the radical reforms that can usher in an era of genuine economic recovery. The tools are in our hands: data, analysis, and sheer will. What remains is the political courage to wield them effectively. Let this be a call not only to economic experts and policymakers but to every individual who cares about the future of our economies. It is time to stop playing with fire and instead build the robust, resilient economic framework that our interconnected world so desperately needs. The current recessionary specter is not a natural phenomenon, it is a man-made crisis, one that can be solved if we dare to confront the truth head-on. In the meanwhile, as we watch the latest data and listen to the guarded statements from central bankers, let us hold them accountable. Whether it's quoting that 2.8% inflation figure in the UK or highlighting the record surplus in EU-US trade, we must keep the conversation alive. For the future of our economy, for the jobs and livelihoods of millions, the time to demand change is now.